Hello friends, I'm Aman Agarwal and today I'm going to show you a game played between Anish, Giri and Wesley in the semi-finals of the Magnus Carlsen Invitational knockout stage. So in this game, Anish Giri is playing with the white pieces and Wesley is playing with the black pieces. So here in this position, Anish Giri opens with the move 1 E4, E5, knight to F3 and knight to C6. And now bishop to B5. As you will see in the top level, when white plays E4 and E5, knight F3 and knight to C6, in the lower level, people always go for the Italian with bishop to C4, but in the higher level, they always go for the WhiteElo pace, which is the more solid line. Knight to F6, the Berlin defense, and D3, with some plans of later going for C3, D4, striking the center and taking his position in the center. Bishop to C5, bishop takes C6, D takes C6, and now you might think that the idea of taking there was taking this pawn, but this would turn out to be a huge blunder because of queen to D5, and although this pawn is protected, but there is a mate threat on F7 and this knight is attacked. So now castles, knight D7, C3, A5, and it is the common strategy to put the rook pawns, which will help later in the endgame to activate the rooks. D4, striking in the center and pushing back the bishop. Bishop to D6, defending the E5 pawn. Rook A E1, rook to E1. A4, knight B to D2. E takes G4 and C takes G4 was played in the game, but here the computer suggests a better move would have been knight to C4, because after takes, you can take on D6, and if a pawn takes, queen takes G6, and if black takes on B2, bishop takes B2, and we have a good position and enough compensation for a pawn because the activity of our pieces is much more than black. But this was not what was played in the game, and so here pawn takes on D4, knight to B6, stopping the knight from coming to C4, knight to F1, trying to reshuffle the knight later to E3 or to G3, castles, bishop to G5, hitting the queen from the bishop is protected from the knight, and now F6, bishop to H4, keeping the bishop on the diagonal to keep the pawn pinned, bishop to G4, threatening that if white moves the queen, he would ruin the structure, H3, trying to kick away the bishop, but black also keeps the bishop on that very diagonal, queen to D3, queen to D7, G4, kicking away the bishop to G6, pinning the pawn, and knight to E3. According to the computer, it's a bit of an inaccuracy because of the move A3, and after B3, bishop to B4, hitting the rook and C4. This would give back a good position because he has enough counterplay even with the black pieces. And so this was, but Wesley failed to find this move, and he played the move knight D5. Of course, we can't take because our queen would hang then. Therefore, knight to F5, knight to F4 and queen F1, which is a brilliant move because white has later ideas of the game, because after takes, he can take and G3 takes, and when white would kick away this knight, he can go queen G2, king H2 and rook G1, which will expose the black king a lot. But he plays the move bishop takes F2, bishop takes F5, G takes F5, G6, bishop to G3, knight to H5, hitting the bishop, F takes G6, H takes G6, and now queen to D2, placing the king on the same file as black. Here, black played the move king H7, removing the king from the same file, rook A D1. Here in this position, white could have gone for the move E5, but solid Anish Giri first plays rook D1, making E5 an even stronger threat because after takes and takes, this bishop would be lost because this bishop would be pinned. Therefore, now rook A D1, rook A E8, and now here A3. Here you might think why E5 was not played. It was a considerable move, but after takes, bishop to B4 would be an irritating move. Therefore, first A3, bishop takes G3, f takes g3, queen to d6. And now king to h2 here because this pawn was attacked. And here in this position, one may consider playing the move g4, but it's not that great a move because remember guys, whenever a pawn is pushed forward, it cannot come backwards, and that means that this f4 square would be permanent request for black's knight. Therefore, king to h2, rook to e7, rook to d2, king to g7, and now e5. And here queen to d7, rook e4, trying to double up maybe on the e file. Queen d5, which was not a great move, and it was a blunder because that exposed the black king a lot and gave the advantage to white, and here Anish Giri played brilliantly from here. E takes f6, king takes f6, and now rook to e5 hitting the queen. Queen to d7, rook to g5, and now queen d6. Rook f2, trying to launch a discovery. King to g7, knight to h4, hitting this pawn. He goes rook to e6, defending it. Knight to f5 check. Anish Giri very solid, winning an exchange because the king and queen are forked and this pawn is pinned. Therefore, rook takes h5, rook takes f5. Queen takes g4, the pawn was hanging so he picked it up. And now rook to g4, queen to d6, and rook to f2. Here in this position, one might think what's the problem with taking here, but this guy would turn out to be a huge blunder because of queen to d6, and now queen to d2 and rook to d2 would be an unstoppable threat. Therefore, rook f2, and now rook to e3, rook to e2, rook to d3, because here white was offering an exchange of rooks, but black didn't want it because there's already an exchange down and they wouldn't favor an exchange. Therefore, rook to d3, queen to f2, c5, and rook to g5. c4 Wesley so trying to gain counterplay on the queen side, but that's not possible because the b2 pawn is still there. Rook g to e5, this was not that great a move because it left the g3 pawn hanging. Knight takes g3, but now rook e7 check, maybe that was the idea behind sacrificing the g3 pawn. Now king h6, weakening the king. Queen to f8 check, further weakening the position of the black king. King to g5, and now rook to g2, pinning the knight. Rook to e3, and now rook to f7, asking for an exchange of queens. Here Wesley so played the move queen to d1, which was a huge blunder and which would have resulted in mate in 3, but Anish Giri missed it. Can you think how? Yes, rook takes on g3, rook takes on g3, and now the move is queen e7 after king h3, rook to h7, which resulted in a mate. But Anish Giri missed this, but nevertheless this was already a one position. Therefore, rook to f1 back. This rook cannot be captured because the knight is pinned, and if you capture with the queen, this queen is defending it right out here. Therefore, queen to d3, and final move of the game, rook to f4, after which Wesley so resigned. You might be thinking, what is the need of resignation? Oh, black can play any simple move like b6 and there is no mate. But no, there is a mate after h4, king to h5, and queen to h8 would be a mate. Therefore, in this position, he would have to play queen f4 to stop the mate, and then white would pick up the queen, takes, and after queen g8, it would be a completely winning position for white. Therefore, in this position, Wesley so resigned the game and Anish Giri won it. So friends, I hope you liked this video. If you did, do like the video and never forget to leave your comments in the comment section below and also subscribe to my channel. Thank you.